Hello, I am Ramaya, Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. We are pleased to welcome you today to this timely and important conversation about the 2021 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation that is taking place right now in Dakar. 55 countries, 500 participants, big announcements. This summit that is held only every 3 years is always an event. It is to a live commentary you are invited to today with our very esteemed guests you are going to discover in a few seconds in a very high-level and promising debate moderated by our senior fellow, Aubrey Ruby. China is Africa's largest trading partner, largest investor, and largest lender. In the past 20 years, trade and investment between them have increased 20-fold and 100-fold, respectively. African countries now expect more from this partner. This FOCAC seems to be the right moment to rethink the Africa-China partnership. Debt, loans, local processing programs for raw materials, technology transfers. There is a lot to discuss. Before to give the floor to the panel, I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart those who are going to participate in this very exciting conversation. Professor Carlos Lopez, Karim El Ainawi, my dear Paulo Gomez, and Hannah Ryder. From Washington, where we are, US-Africa policy has increasingly been rightly or wrongly framed in the context of US-China global competition. While the White House is currently drafting a new Africa strategy, and Secretary Blinken just finished his first African trip, it's critical to ensure that the African view and approach are better understood in Washington and Beijing. Having said that, I'm thrilled to cede the floor to Aubrey. Thanks for listening, and over to you, Aubrey.
Thank you, Ambassador Yat. It is totally my pleasure to be having this conversation today with friends and to really look at the evolution of the Chinese commercial footprint in African markets. I remember almost over 2.5 years ago, Hannah and Paulo and I traveled to Dubai to look at other countries and how they were investing in the region. But it's hard to ignore the biggest player in terms of the largest financier of African infrastructure and one who's seen as kind of a stalwart partner. And so we have views all the way from Hannah, who's in Dakar, Carlos, who's in Cape Town, and Paulo, who's in Abidjan, and Karim, who's in Morocco. So we're getting a Pan-African view of what happened at FOCAC 2021. And so, Hannah, let's start with you. You are the CEO of Development Reimagined. You spend your time building relationships, business relationships, beyond China and Africa, other countries as well, but you've really been an expert in this space, and you're in Dakar. What's the feeling been like? What have you seen? What are your first impressions?
Well, it's been very busy, that's for sure. And in the run-up to it, very busy too. Before I really begin, let me just say thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for putting together this discussion and for inviting me to be part of it. Look, this is the discussions that have been here and the happening here in FOCAC. We've had yesterday with the speeches from a number of different presidents, of course, the Chinese president, but also South Africa in their presidency of the AU, and South Africa, representing the South African region, and DRC in the presidency of the AU, and a number of other countries. And today, there has been a discussion of a number of documents. 4 are just being released as we speak, I believe. And that's actually very different to the previous FOCACs, which have all had 2 documents. We have this time a kind of long-term perspective, a document which is focused on where do China and Africa go up to 2035. And we also have a
vision document that they've been talking about. Yep.
Yes. And there's also a climate change plan. So this is discussing and negotiating all of that has taken a lot longer, I guess, than it might have done in other situations, but also because of COVID-19. There has been much more of a detailed coordination process in Beijing in order to get to where we are now in Dakar. So it's a culmination of a great deal of work, a lot of input from the African side, and obviously ideas from the Chinese side as well. And that's what all of the announcements are. Definitely the 1 billion vaccines doses from China has been very much welcomed, especially because that was announced yesterday from President Xi. That can really make a huge difference to the existing vaccine challenges that many countries are facing, most African countries are facing. But there's a number of other announcements, so hopefully we'll be discussing all those today.
Yeah, and Karim, I'd like to come to you. I mean, you're the executive president of the Policy Center for the New South. You've looked extensively at China-Africa relations. What do you see as different in the 2021 FOCAC than in years prior?
I like to take the long view. First of all, let me thank our friends at the Atlantic Council, yourself, and also Rama and her team. I would say the context is different. I think the kind of dynamics, the kind of the relations China wants to build in Africa has not changed much. The fundamental motives are remaining the same. But the context is different. I think we are, in a way, in a sort of different world where we were, before COVID. It's not like there's overnight changes, but I think fundamentally it's our perceptions, our view of the world, our expectations that have changed. And as we know, if you think it is changing, then it is changing. And I think there is a zeitgeist now in terms of, the word, the rivalry you mentioned, China, US. The numbers also are not very good. The stock of US FDI in Africa has declined, actually. It's been negative over the next 10 years in terms of annual average growth, and the stock has declined. Trade has declined in terms of in terms of growth. So the context, and therefore, I think we're in a way at a critical juncture. So we could see more impact, more transformational changes. I don't know how the future will shape, but what I can tell you is that the cards that will be played, in a way, the fundamental, the sort of turnover, the choices will have an important role and determine the future, in a way. Yeah. So I cannot tell you right now the meeting is ongoing, but what I shared with you is a bit of my feeling, and Africa is in a way observing, taking note, being quite open as Africa is always, glad to engage with others. So this is a bit my take at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a good point. There's always the text of what's signed, there's the context in which it happens, and then there's the subtext, right? And the context, of course, is during the COVID period and the kind of health diplomacy that we saw before. I mean, Paulo, I want to come to you. You're the chairman of New Africa Partners, but you've been very involved with Afro Champions, which has been an initiative to bring together the kind of African COVID response and buying vaccines, et cetera. So do you still see China as a leader in kind of vaccine diplomacy?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Rama and Aubrey, for putting this together. Yeah, I mean, definitely the urgency now is the vaccine. We have seen how the rest of the world has just suddenly behaved in closing their door and banning flight coming from Africa. So it reminds us as African that we need to get ourselves together and organize ourselves. You just need a variant that was, by the way, sequenced by Africans to be out, and then immediately the rest of the world has started to again take care of itself first. So the signal from the Chinese is a very strong one. The organization to vaccinate people in most of our country is still lacking. We have pushed a lot through the COVID special fund and organized with the leadership of Africa Exim Bank to provide financing to African countries to buy Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So some of the country has been very proactive in buying those vaccines. Actually, the price we have managed to get for that was around $10 per vaccine. So countries that are focused and very serious have managed to buy those, because at this point, you just need to buy a vaccine for your people. So this signal by the Chinese is a very important signal, and I think will be very much welcome. But I think the most of the focus on this Chinese African relationship is more driven by economy, and this is why people are waiting to see, because we still have an issue of domestic savings, so we need resources for infrastructure. We have all agreed about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and for that to happen, we need to finance infrastructure. The rest of the world has to understand. We don't have time as an African to be in the geopolitics. We need resources to finance our infrastructure so we can trade. And if we trade, we develop industry, so we create jobs for our people. So,
right, and that's the need that's really undergirded the Chinese-African relationship, is that, filling the infrastructure financing gap. But as we know, the U.S. is unlikely to ever play that role, right? There are certain partners that bring different strengths to the table. And, from one perspective, maybe outside of digital infrastructure, the U.S. doesn't do a lot of traditional transport infrastructure. It's just not how the economic structure of the U.S. economy is made. And so the comparison of like same to same, I think is not necessarily fair. But Kareem's point about the reduction in U.S. investment and the lack of the ability to evolve it as fast as the Chinese has been one that's been interesting. I want to bring Professor Lopez in because, another area of context in which it's taking place is that Africa is the youngest continent. And so I had a piece out yesterday talking about really there's an arc of innovation and youth-led global culture coming out of the region. And how does China speak to that? Is that how will the Chinese really shape the young persons and the young people's desire on the continent moving forward before the next FOCAC, in your view?
Well, if I take into account the speech by President Xi Jinping, I must express a bit of disappointment. I think not for the reasons that most people will probably mention, because I think it's not different from what other donors and other partners of the continent say. Is, the numbers are more impressive, probably,
yeah.
But, they are not coming with a structurally different proposal for engagement with Africa, as it was the case in the previous FOCAC, where, they were mentioning of structural transformation aspects, like, accelerating industrialization. Now there is a passing remark on industrialization. When we talk about the vaccines, it's basically about distributing manufactured vaccines in China is not very different from distributing manufactured vaccines from pharmaceuticals in Western countries. So it's about Africa as a consumption market. It's not Africa as an opportunity for structural transformation. So that is a disappointment. And I think when you look into the demographics associated with the current pandemic, we realize that the map of infections seems to follow the average age of the population. So the more aging characteristics you have, the more you are basically infected. That's why Africa has been somehow in the better side of the sanitary dimensions of the crisis. But this being said, the least infected are the most affected. The least infected from a sanitary point of view are the most affected from an economic and social point of view.
Yeah.
And that is interesting because you mentioned the youth. And Aubrey, I always mention associated to that idea that when we think of the Agenda 2030, we think of intergenerational solidarity. We are preserving the planet, after all, for the generations that are going to succeed the current ones. So we are basically asking the richer countries that are aging to preserve the planet for the younger people that are mostly in other regions of the world, not their regions. And unless we have a global social contract idea, this is not going to work, because people will keep basically twisting as much as they can the structural governance to make sure that they preserve the consumption patterns of the rich north, because they want to protect their population to keep the wealth that they have.
The social compact idea brings up the kind of environmental element that is, as Hannah mentioned, a new dimension. And what do you think with the Chinese? I mean, is it really credible if they're coming and talking about environmental, mitigation and support, when we know China is the largest emitter in the world?
It's even worse, because I think there is now a tendency to, just put aside the real difficult questions relating to demography. When you think that you need this social contract in terms of intergenerational solidarity to work across the world, you are basically accepting that the consumption market of the future is going to be Africa, because the more tech intensive your products are, and the Chinese know this, the more appealing they will be for younger populations, and the younger populations are going to be mostly in Africa. So this is the market of the future. Now, when you look into the behavior of the most countries, the partners of the continent, including China, you see that they have not completely absorbed this long-term view. Chinese normally are known for having a long-term view, but in this case, they are more worried about how they are going to basically push their market share in the new products to Africa, and making sure that Africa is going to be an early adopter or some of the brands and technologies.
Well, they already have. Look at technophones. I mean, look at the penetration on the actual mobile handset. But one might say that's deserved. The Chinese have invested a lot. They've re-engineered the phone to be, better take pictures of dark faces in dark light. And so, many would say that's deserved. But I want to stay on the same question of youth, and come back to you, Hannah. One of the things we talked about is training and scholarships, and how more and more young people, more and more Africans are studying in China. And we know that China surpassed the United States back in 2015, 2016 as hosting the largest number of English-speaking students, as the US has not kept up its kind of leadership role in education. Of current African leaders, 20% studied in the United States. That will not be the case in 10, 20 years. So any thoughts, Hannah, you have on the educational scholarship piece of this?
Yeah, well, I also want to come back to some points that Carlos raised and others raised on some of the other broader issues, but let me come directly to what you mentioned first. One of the issues, of course, and it's very, very clear here, COVID-19 has put a massive brake on students and business people even going back to China. So that has been a massive issue of contention. Now, it's not just African students, of course, it's all foreign students, but basically the path remains pretty closed. It's all online at the moment. So there's a question as to when that will be reopened. I think that hasn't been resolved in this FOCAC. I think there was a hope that it would be a kind of path set forward for when it would be opened up, but it seems that that's not yet happening. But nevertheless, I think it's something which certainly the ambassadors that we work with are very, very cognizant, working very hard to try to open up and see what the way is through on that. But what is clear is China's still trying to say, look, we're still going to keep doing kind of training, capacity building as much as we can, even online. And we're going to expand lots of digital work with you. I think that's one of the key themes that will come out in the FOCAC documents. You will see a massive focus on digital, on digital infrastructure, and also on products, of course. From a range of, there was a white paper that just came out before FOCAC, the China Africa, kind of what they said was a kind of vision of but it was more about data rather than vision. But it's a white paper, and it has some new numbers. For example, numbers of countries who are working with China on smart cities and that sort of thing. So we'll see a big focus on digital continuing. And again, that will impact on youth, of course, and especially in the COVID-19 context, will have a big impact. But I just want to
go ahead.
Could I come back to this point on the African market? Because I think what Carlos was saying was absolutely right, that definitely Chinese companies and Chinese government, of course, see the African continent as a big market. We're going to be having 2.5 billion people by 2050 predicted. So of course, but I think there is, in the FOCAC and even in President Xi's speech, there was more of an emphasis on African imports to African exports to China. So there was a new goal that was mentioned, and it's quite huge: $300 billion of African exports to China, which is a massive jump from where they are right now at around 100 billion. So the question is, what do those look like? What are the components? Are they added value? Are they diversified? But I think that's one area in which there's a real opportunity for African businesses and others to really jump in and get to.
Yeah, definitely. I saw that as well, fast tracking some African exports. And that's always been one of the complaints the African side has had in the China relationship, is that it's not just about buying Chinese made products, it's about buying African exports as well, and not just the minerals that Chinese companies are mining in DRC and other countries. Karim, any thoughts you have on this question about exporting to China and what potential there is and around industrialization?
Oh, that's a wide question. Continuing a little bit what Paulo was saying, I think China has well understood that the African market is a continuation of an extension of their domestic market in terms of maturity. So it's a sort of junction between, between where they are today, which is great imitators, but not innovators yet. And so the African market maybe is where China was, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, basic consumption goods, etc. Where I'm a bit sort of, have questions about foreign direct investment. I mean, they continue to produce mainly in China. They're not anymore that competitive, but still on those basic sort of consumption goods, So there's a conundrum. So let's not forget that China is facing, huge challenge in terms of continuing its development path, which is sort of getting out of the middle income trap, which is very difficult, moving to a higher income status, what Japan and Korea have done. So this is a sort of
but the cost of labor getting more expensive, right? So that's in theory push jobs to African markets.
And not necessarily being great at imitating, basic planes and, aviation, and even sending, in the space, we call it satellites, is still sort of an imitation process, a great imitation, a complex one, but still an imitation. So I think on the African side, I'm a bit worried about the macroeconomic situation of many countries and the debt and etc. So to export, you need to have goods to export. So you need to have industrial policies, great agriculture policies that are sort of well integrated. So it takes a lot. And many countries have still a long way to go in terms of fixing their domestic policies and being sort of sound macroeconomic policies, smart industrial policies. There are successes here and there, but there's not a sort of a general story about the continent. The general story, I would say, is a bit gloomy compared to the 3 years ago. There are some great stories, country per country, sectors by sector. So again, this is the point I made initially, and I'll stop there. This is the point that this is a critical juncture for many reasons, for internal Chinese reasons, for Africa, sort of, where it stands today, recovering from COVID, increasing public debt, challenges on the macroeconomic front. And it's also a critical juncture for the US and Europe as well, in terms of what kind of the relation they want with the world. We know the kind of relation that's going to be with China, but what is it in the end? It's important that our main partners tell us and sort of anchor our expectation of the nature of the relation. I think there is still a sort of a bit undecided, or maybe I'm not aware of it, but there's the perception that this is not yet that clear.
Yeah. So, Paulo, Carlos, you want to chime in on the question of African debt? Did FOCAC, did the Chinese bring enough to the table? I mean, look at what Kenya was, they were asking Kenya to pay the debt on the standard gauge rail during middle of COVID. There was some pushback on that request to pay. Do we see actually debt forgiveness in a meaningful way? I don't know if Paulo or Carlos, you want to chime in there.
I certainly would like to comment on it, but I know Paulo will have views too.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there is always an exaggeration when we talk about the debt in relation to China, the sovereign debt of Africans in relation to China. I think it's very important for us to bear in mind that normally countries in Africa go to the option of China because the other two options are less concessional funding available in relation to the increased size of our GDP, which is not normally recognized. So the concessional funding has not grown at the same pace as our GDP growth. And second, the commercial opportunities being so expensive. So the Chinese have nicely placed themselves in the middle. So they are not as expensive as the purely commercial opportunities, but they are not concessional either. So I think the more the merrier. The more they give, the more I welcome. Because this is really a lifeline for countries to be able to have a bit more of a flexibility.
But of course, it depends on the use of the debt, right? I mean, you take out loans to go to school.
That's the key point.
Make more money. Good.
Exactly, that's the key point.
And bad debt, right?
That's the key point. But I wanted to mention another issue that relates to your point about Kenya. I think the agency of the Africans can be exercised in many ways, but one certainly a great opportunity for them to exercise agency is to negotiate better. And I know that when you negotiate, you get better deals with the Chinese. And one example is certainly the fact that Chinese cannot afford the reputational risk. It's very difficult for the Chinese to be exposed publicly into a spat with any country, particularly an African country, in relation to debt-related issues. So they always find a way. So you have to negotiate. You have to be capable of negotiating with some degree of sophistication. And when you do so, you are going to always get a good deal. And I think that's the lesson. And that's why you have solved the problem in Kenya and solve all the problems that different countries are facing. Now, if you choose to make a big show out of your relations with China being under a different track, that's a political choice. It's not a really good decision from an economic point of view.
Right. Paulo, do you want to chime in on the debt issues?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, China has lost the communication battle on this narrative of debt. At such a point that's probably the reason why Carlos was saying that he was a little bit disappointed by the speech, is that the Chinese, I think, are struggling a little bit with their image as far as the issue of debt. And they wanted basically to play safe on this FOCAC. Look, this issue of debt, if you remember in the 80s and 90s, how the bilateral country in Europe and the US have built up the debt. And then we had the whole episode of the Paris Club and then the HIPIC initiative. So it is not new. I think the issue with China is that things went quite fast with a lot of loans for infrastructure. No doubt that some of them were loaded with corruption, and that I think the Chinese themselves will recognize that that has happened. But it's not a reason to totally turn the page of the funding from China. That's why I was linking with the discussion earlier on the Continental Free Trade Agreement. If we want to create a caution and enable Africans to trade among themselves, we have to trade among ourselves. So this episode of people closing their border will not happen. And then we create also job for our people. You need to finance your infrastructure. We need mobility. We still need a lot of roads. We need transmission lines. We need port in order to trade and then create industry. Someone has to provide that capital. So either we go to the US and we try to get it because it's washed with capital. And
or the market, the private investors, right?
The market, you know, how timid they are. And that's why I think what probably is missing with this FOCAC episode is Africa doing its homework properly. I don't think that we have space with China to go on small projects bilaterally. I think there is room here for some regional project so we can negotiate in blocks for some investment that will have structural impact. You know, if you take a country like mine with, I think, less than $2 billion GDP, you know, how much can you get in terms of loans without your package of debt to explode? So you need to plug yourself into a regional investment. For example, a road that leaves Lagos to go to Abidjan. You need transmission lines. You need investment into some dam, for example, like in West Africa and in East Africa and Central Africa. So I was hoping for us as Africans to do a better homework to try to identify some of the structural projects that we need, transformative projects. Then we negotiate with China in a bigger block, rather than going divided the way we go for small petty project that at the end of the day will come back and bite you in terms of your debt ratio.
And Paolo, I know Hannah wants to jump in here, but I want to ask, I mean, what has China done on AFCFTA? I mean, I think the talking point is that they're supportive of AFCFTA. I'm not sure what's actually been done. Do you think, what do you think they should do to support the Continental Free Trade Agreement? And then we'll come to Hannah on it.
Well, I think, again, it's as I said, the key for trade is mobility of goods. So you need to invest in those infrastructure that will allow that. And then we'll adjust in the value chain. There are things happening in the value chain, as you are saying, in terms of some of the export. And I think you will see more countries getting access to the Chinese market in terms of transforming coffee, cocoa, and probably some of the energy product. But the issue of mobility has to be really a priority. And that's
transport infrastructure is a strength of the Chinese. So, and that's been something they've been doing for some time. But I agree on regional projects and how to structure those regional projects. Because, you know, one of the challenges of regional projects in the past, when you try to do it at a project finance way, so a Western capital markets way, you always have trouble because you have multiple country risks and you can't really figure that out, right? So maybe China is a good play on that. But first, let me come to Hannah and then I'll come to Karim.
Yeah, so again, looking, because my firm, we've been poring over the speech and the documents. So one of the things that is worth noting is, yes, there was no sort of big, we're still going to keep on doing it when we're going to, you know, do 20 billion of concessional loans, etc. That there wasn't that. There were a number of different things that add up to about 40 billion is what we saw. But on top of that, what President Xi's speech said is there's going to be, China will support 10 regional projects, regional connectivity projects. Now, the question is, as Africans, what are those regional connectivity projects going to be? What are our priorities? And can we put those in front of Chinese stakeholders as quickly as possible? That is, you know, again, the ball is in our court. Carlos mentioned the word agency. We have potential for agency. And the point is now, once you've got the stage for that engagement, and, you know, Chinese, I would say that the Chinese government is kind of recognizing that regional infrastructure is the way to go, in particular because of AFCFTA. But that's what many of us, of Africans involved in these discussions have been saying. go regional, that will be where you get the best bang for your buck in any case in terms of the financing paid back, but also in terms of the economic improvement and the transformational impact that, again, Carlos was mentioning, structural transformation, the impact on trade.
So in addition to the AFCFTA question we've had from the audience, we have another one on tech transfer. You know, that's part of it, right? You can't do the production without some tech transfer. Hannah, do you see anything on tech transfer in the in FOCAC?
Actually, not in particular, although I think there are some elements in terms of intellectual property which are interesting to look at. There's a recognition that African intellectual property matters. And also a recognition in the FOCAC, in the action plan on data sovereignty, for instance, which again is going to be important in the context of digital improvement. So there is some recognition of it. And then ideas of sort of capacity building so that Africans can take forward. There's a very clear commitment. Coming back to the beginning of the conversation on vaccines, we were talking about local manufacturing. What China said is 600 million of the 1 billion will be donations from China, but 400 million will be from locally manufactured. So with a range of African countries potentially, and I think they'll be discussing with the AU Africa CDC on exactly which of those countries will be, right? So I think there is a willingness. They're very clear that that they agree with things like a waiver on IP and so on for vaccines. These sorts of things are all there. But again, they've been put forward by many African interlocutors on this. Yep.
Karim, you wanted to come in on regional projects?
No, I had a point on what you mentioned about sort of the global finance, the regulatory framework and the way the global finance work and not being adapted to the African context. I think that's the heart of the issue. And that's where China has been sort of, has brought up a proposition that is adapted to this developmental stage of Africa. If you take the current regulatory framework at the global level, no investors will, managing an infra fund will put its money in Africa, that's for sure, because it's a different environment, it's not as much as developed, but that's really where international organizations should sort of bridge that gap, and that's not really happening.
Yeah.
And China has sort of proposed a one-size-fits-all, sort of all-in-one solution where they have state guarantees, you have companies, you have the risk, they're bearing the risks, etc. So I think that's something we need to think of. And that's actually why we need to reform the World Bank, particularly, and including the African Development Bank. We need to invent a new finance for the last frontier of development, which is Africa, in a way. Let's not forget that China was a low-income country not so long ago. The generations that are now managing the country have lived in the China that was not so far away from many countries in Africa, a middle-income country. So very good understanding, for instance, you were talking about infrastructure, the importance of infrastructure. When you talk to a European, for him, it's something strange, it's been built, a century ago. And so there's a sort of cognitive dissonance here with no sort of efficient solution on the table. And I don't think it can be market-based, okay? It has to be engineered. It has to be deterministic. It has to be built. And it's more complex, Hubri, than we think. It's more complex than the Washington consensus. Fix your investment, your climate, your business sort of climate, fix your policies, and then it's going to happen. No. The risk, the returns corrected by the risk that companies, that private investors are asking are impossible, even if Africa can grow, 6-7% on a very long run basis. So here we have a fundamental sort of issue to fix. On tech transfer, one word, look, China has been very smart using the local content ratio in its contracts, sort of dealing the access to its domestic market, to high-speed trains, to sort of...
but you can do that with 1 billion people. AFCFTA maybe can do that.
We have quite a few in Africa, so that can be Pan-African, that can be part of, the African Free Trade Agreement, that can be part of the African Union sort of role. That's something we could negotiate as a whole. They've been doing well on that one and benefiting from it and being able, to imitate very well. Now, sort of projecting the economy, themselves in Africa, their companies on that basis. So.
Yep. So I want to spend the next bit of our conversation, the last bit, on informing the process. I mean, as Ambassador Yad said, the U.S. is currently writing its Africa strategy, right? And as Africans and as internationalists in business, et cetera, all of you, what would you like it to say? What would you like it to be in there, and how would it be different, or what should they learn from the Chinese? How should the U.S. distinguish themselves from the Chinese? What are the kind of main takeaways that should inform that process from FOCAC? Paulo, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I think, the U.S. strategy toward Africa, for me, it's a useful tool for African to, or to the U.S. to interact with Africa. But I always take the thinking the other side and saying, what the Africa strategy toward the U.S.?
Right.
And that would be the first thing I will do, because it would be difficult for me to engage with the US if it's not clear in my mind exactly where I'm going. So now we have at least the Vision 63, we have the CFTA. So the issue is to say, okay, in this approach on discussing about the strategy, let's discuss what you want to do with us in terms of the CFTA. And it goes back to what I'm saying, mobility, and mobility. Trade is about moving people, moving goods. And the infrastructure deficit is so big. But look at the US. I mean, when the US goes and spend $1 trillion to refurbish infrastructure, it shows that infrastructure is important. Even as Karim was saying, that this is something that is done for the US, but look at how much money they are bringing back to upgrade the infrastructure. Yeah. We have this thing.
But there's infrastructure for the future too, right? So maybe one area, US has digital infrastructure, movement of data across borders.
Exactly.
All the fintech providers are funded by US venture capitalists, right? There's a view of moving finance across borders and moving data across borders, not just people and goods.
And just to go to the classic one, without going in actually in terms of digitalization, you look at the energy we need and how suddenly into this process, the countries that using basic coal, at least for energy, will be penalized with this process of climate change. And in the case of Zimbabwe and others that will have to suffer on that. And the discussion about also energy transition, where people basically even are thinking that gas is not a good thing for Africa. I mean, that's ridiculous. We need that energy. So I think we need to reset the discussion. But it will depend if the US want to listen, because it has to be a process of listening first to my priorities. And one of the priorities, definitely the CFTA, in terms of creating the capacity for Africa to trade with itself and the rest of the world, obviously, and create the base for industrialization, because it's the only way that will enable us to create a job. And go back also to the reform of the multilateral institution. The system simply doesn't work. I've spent more than 10 years in the international system with the World Bank and others. That framework doesn't work anymore. And we need, that Karim was saying, to review how you start things from a different perspective, how you fund those kind of a project that are transformational in terms of a set of countries instead of country by country as it has been done so far. And I think that's something we need to bring the Chinese back into the discussion on how we address those 6 or 7 regional projects together. And how to slice it in terms of the financing in order to have an impact at the regional level. So those will be my main priorities that I will focus on.
And Carlos, how about you? What would you want US policymakers to take away from FOCAC and even into their thinking on Africa strategy?
I'm not very optimistic that the like-minded discourse is going to be serious. There are lots of proclamations that are done. If I just follow the number one proclamation, which is that we are going to finish with poverty by 2030, we have 9 years to go. Nobody really believes on these things. We promised green fund, we promised climate funding, all these things, just don't materialize. So we are going to have probably a political engagement that is going to camouflage the real issue. And the real issue is that there is a tech battle between China and the US. This is sort of the new Cold War. It's a tech war. And we are going to be used in Africa, as a terrain for positioning between these two. And I don't think this is going to be possible to change. Not by the Africans, not by the US, not by China, because it's in the nature of things. Now, we can, let me come again with the agency, we can take advantage of some windows of opportunity. One of the opportunities is the fact that you cannot really have the various transitions we are talking about in terms of the climate transition and more specifically the energy transition without Africa participating in it in one way or another. We cannot attain the reduction of temperature that is being discussed, just once again in Glasgow, without using green hydrogen. The green hydrogen opportunities are the best are in Africa because of the confluence of sea and desert. You cannot really think of electric vehicles and the new forms of mobility without resources that are mostly in Africa. Mining resources are mostly in Africa. You cannot do 3D printing, upscale without graphite, which is mostly in Africa. So I can go on with the list. Now, the issue is whether the Africans are going to accept that all these transitions are going to take place with them playing yet again the role of provider of commodities without value addition, or they are going to seize this opportunity to actually catapult their transformation. And the best partners for the continent are going to be the ones that allow this catapulting to take place, this leapfrogging to take place. Is it going to be China? Is it going to be the US? I hope the US will come on board. I certainly believe that the Chinese are a bit more advanced in proposing this type of opportunities to Africa than the US. But, the jury's out.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Carlos. Karim?
Not much to say, just the process maybe, and is more important than the outcome. So I think dialogue, discussions, exchange, listening. I don't think there's a sort of fundamental strategy that is always true and appropriate. So I think this is a constant dialogue, constant exchange. It's an intention rather than a roadmap. The intention is important, the political capital you're ready to spend, the time you're ready to spend on Africa. I think there's an important agenda fundamental agenda where the US can contribute is the reform of the World Bank in particular, to make it efficient. And I think we need the World Bank. It's an important institution, but it needs to be sort of transformed, needs to evolve to respond to the challenges of the lower income countries of the world, not only in Africa. It happens that many are in Africa. That would be, I think, important. It's not about announcement of billions and zillions, and how to make global finance work for Africa, which is a sort an optimal proposition. It's not about aid. It's about making money while investing in Africa and while bringing the underwriting mechanism that allow investor to be comfortable. Partly, the part of the work has to be done by African countries themselves, and And part of the work, of course, has to be done by those who are shaping the regulatory framework of the international finance, which is the IMF, which is, of course, the G20, the International Bank of Settlement, all the norms and the standards we are producing. So I think that would be, in a way, my modest advice, and this is not, this is the arc of history. So this is not a 5-year time horizon. I think we're talking things that are in the long run. But again, this is in a way a critical juncture. So the choices that will be made now in the coming years are choices that will shape, that will give a direction. So this is the sense of history, I would say. And I think, I'm not sure if this sense, this appreciation, this assessment is in the mind of all the policymakers around the world, and in particular.
Well, I think you can be fairly sure that it's not. Long-term thinking by policymakers is not really top of mind right now with all the daily crises. But your point on reshaping the global architecture, especially around finance and development finance, to be more Africa or frontier market centric, is critical, because the U.S. does have a role to play in that, for sure. Given the current architecture and the power structures that be, the U.S. has a lot of power, as do Europeans, to kind of bring in.
Sorry, Aubrey, to interrupt, but this is not only about development finance. This is about also mostly about private capital flows. It's partly about ODA, but also private capital flows.
Yeah,
I find it.
Go ahead.
Audrey, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I find it interesting when I listen to Karim that, so far we have not mentioned the IMF. We keep mentioning the World Bank. The IMF also needs to be the subject of the same. But isn't it interesting that Xi Jinping announced $10 billion worth of SDRs to Africa, but not the totality of the Chinese allocation?
Yeah.
So can I come in with my suggestion right at the end? So I would break my suggestions up into 3. So there's some short term, something in terms of the thinking, and then the practicalities for the longer term. So, and really picking up on what others have said. So I think in the short term, I think there's 2 things that are really worth looking at from the US perspective. One, the SDR reallocation that China's done. So they're saying that they will put aside 25% of SDR of their SDR allocation towards African countries, which is in many ways much more targeted than what other G7, the G7 or G20 members have said that they would do. Some of them have said they'd do 20%, but then that's to all low-income countries, or low middle-income countries, so not specifically to Africa. So I think that's quite different and very interesting, and worth US considering what to do. And the same with the vaccine. That's the other part, to look at local manufacturing. I'm glad to see that Johnson & Johnson just finally agreed the South Africa vaccine production. But I think much more of that can be done. And so again, take that really seriously and look into the local production. In terms of the mind shift, again, it's exactly what Karim and Carlos and Paolo have all been saying. This is about thinking about where is the African continent trying to head to, rather than where is it right now. So I'll give you an example. Rather than thinking about there's 600 million people in Africa who don't have access to energy, think about, well, what are Africa's energy needs going to be in 2063 when Africa is the largest manufacturing hub in the world? So what do we need to do to get there? And what can we as a development partner, if you're the US, what can we do to help stimulate that in a green way, for example? And that's the kind of agenda which is incorporated in Agenda 2063. So my final point is look at Agenda 2063. Look at the frameworks. Look at the 6 frameworks. There's 15 projects. Look at those. See how the US can incorporate that into its overall strategic thinking. Use those as a benchmark. Use those as a means to go forward. And they include so much. Carlos was talking about mining, and there's the African mining vision, which has very significant green elements and value addition elements. So why not have that as part of the US strategy in terms of private sector investment, bringing the value addition and saying that this is why we are a different partner. This is what we're going to be doing with African nations. So I think there's so many different ways in which the US can use the experience of not just FOCAC, but also just really more strongly engage with Africa. So it's good to have the strategy is being redone, and I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah, we all are. And I guess coming back with our last few minutes, I just did maybe you and Paulo, I mean, how can we were in Dubai all together. We saw so much that the Emirates have done. There are other countries. How can the US work with partners? You know, it doesn't have to go it alone. And as we've said, the US structure and what the US is good at might not be the things that Africa needs right away to get to that next level. So I guess the question I have for, maybe I'll start with you, Hannah, and then Paulo, is, you know, what kind of partners and how could there be some innovative tripartite, multi-party kind of structures instead of just like, you know, there's FOCAC, which is China, Africa, and then the US has promised to do a summit. So the US, Africa, you know, how could we think in different groupings? We saw that for a while with the BRICS. We saw that with other things. Could there be different groupings that make sense and are innovative?
Yeah, I think there can, but I think the starting point for that would be to kind of get the African nations African leaders to say, well, why don't we all come together? Why don't we have partners coming together around these particular regional projects? Why don't we coordinate around these regional projects and bring different partners in for different aspects of it? There's no reason why that can't happen. I think it's only that we have this idea of different countries specializing in different aspects. But again, we have the multilateral system as well. And again, it comes back to also what Karim and others were saying, that this is also about reform of the multilateral system. And that's also where you can get the partnerships already established. And the US has so much influence over those institutions. So getting those working better for African interests is really key, as well as doing the trilateral kind of cooperation projects.
Paulo, over to you for any last thoughts here before we.
Yeah, and Aubrey, I think the elephant in the room is the geopolitics, and I think it's here. If we ignore it, it will be our own peril. So I'm trying to see, what will be the one or two things that the two superpower will agree to work together with us. And I will probably target issues related to adaptation and all the issue of mitigation on the climate change, because again, we need to give a price to the carbon. As Carlos was saying, if we are about to preserve the forest, our environment for the next generation, it's definitely important for Africa to be rewarded for that. And I think the carbon price is one of the things that we have to agree on. And if the two superpower can get together and see, or at least Africa try to get them together in terms of the market, carbon market, and try to set a price, I think this will be an additional layer of financing that we can use to fund our infrastructure and probably other platforms that we need for structural transformation.
Well, thank you for that, Paulo, because you kicked off a very important topic for us at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, which is climate finance and inclusive climate finance and rethinking climate finance to make sure it works for Africa. And having kind of a working group focused on this very topic that we'll be launching in the new year. So you really ended on something we wanted to end on. And let me really thank everyone for joining today. As we learn more about FOCAC, we'll have even more takeaways, but we wanted this kind of real-time discussion from Dakar and really to inform this next wave of US policymaking as they consider the innovations China has, the strengths, the weaknesses, and where it can go from here. So thank you to our audience, thank you to our panelists, and look forward to welcome you to the next Africa Center event.